Today's concern, as in yesterday's concern and next Tuesday, is the concern of our conference, which is free speech in the context of academia. And so we were excited to continue that discussion today. For all of the events this year, including the conference, we have been fortunate to have had the work of a planning committee that has organized all the events. And this planning committee has consisted of Joe Lowry in Near Eastern Languages and Civilizations, Sophia Rosenfeld from the History Department, Amy Sepinwall from Wharton, Tukufu Zuberi from Sociology, and my colleague Matt Roth in the Mitchell Center. It's been led, the planning committee, by Sigal Ben-Porath in the Graduate School of Education, a scholar of philosophy, political science, and education, who is also our moderator for today's discussion. Sigal is a very fitting moderator. She's contributed prominently to the issue of campus speech battles, both as a scholar, above all her work, her book, 2017 book, Free Speech on Campus, and also as the chair of Penn's Committee on Open Expression, where she helped resolve numerous cases here on Penn's campus relating to free speech in an academic setting. I would say that not only has Sigal contributed substantively to help think through how to negotiate the various issues at play in free speech on campus, but she's someone whose work has helped explain why these debates are so important and also so complex and so challenging. I take it from Sigal's book and from talking to her personally that she helps us understand the unique situation that we at a university occupy, where we're here to discharge numerous missions. One of these missions is to be a place of intellectual and scientific exchange. But another mission is to cultivate civic capacities, to develop citizenship. But both of these missions, the intellectual exchange mission and the civic mission, have been modulated in recent years by the dramatically different demographic and social situation of universities in the 21st century that are characterized by unprecedented diversity with regard to gender, sexual orientation, social class, and racial and ethnic identity, as well as with regard to nationality. And so Sigal helps us understand how these competing concerns create a specific circumstance we occupy today. And I think her work is important, not just in trying to resolve the challenges, but to clarify and diagnose them. She's someone, I think, whose appreciation for the significance and complexity of the topic has been truly contagious for myself, and I'm sure for many other members of the planning committee. Perhaps an example of one of the few good forms of contagion we've experienced in 2020. In any case, we're very grateful to have her as our moderator today. Before turning things over to Sigal, I should just thank our very generous co-sponsors of the conference, which are the Penn Graduate School of Education, the SNF Paideia Foundation, and the Jack Miller Center. So Sigal, thank you so much.
Thank you, Jeff. And thank you everyone for joining us this afternoon. I'm very excited to continue the conversation about campus free speech issues. And I'm especially excited for today's event. We have two events today. I'll mention the second one towards the end this afternoon. But for now, I'm very excited to welcome our speaker, Geoffrey Stone. He's the Edward H. Levy Distinguished Service Professor at the University of Chicago, where he has been on the faculty since 1973 after having served as a law clerk to Supreme Court Justice William J. Brennan, Jr. He later served as Dean of the Law School and Provost of the University of Chicago. Stone is the author and editor of too many books to mention right now, but I just want to mention a couple that are very relevant to our conversation. Democracy and Equality, the Enduring Constitutional Vision of the Warren Court from 2019, The Free Speech Century from 2018, and Sex and the Constitution from 2017. His next book will be National Security, Leaks, and the Freedom of the Press that is supposed to come out or is planned to come out in 2021. Among his many presidential and public appointments, again, I cannot list them all here, he has served as chair of the board of both the American Constitution Society and the Chicago Children's Choir. So quite a diverse types of service here. Stone has also written amicus briefs for constitutional scholars in a number of important Supreme Court cases, for example, cases on marriage equality, on reproductive access, and many other key issues. But for today, I really want to mention one of his accomplishments. In 2015, Professor Stone has crafted for his university the current version of the Chicago Statement on Open Expression, revising his original one, which he has kindly shared with us in preparation for this talk, and which has in recent years been promoted by various organizations and endorsed by many universities in the US and Canada, sometimes even at the encouragement of their governments, as is the case in some of the provincial governments in Canada. The 2015 Chicago Statement reads in part, I'm going to just read a couple lines. In a word, the university's fundamental commitment is to the principle that debate or deliberation may not be suppressed, because the ideas put forth are thought by some, or even by most, members of the university community to be offensive, unwise, immoral, or wrong-headed. It is for the individual members of the university community, not for the university as an institution, to make those judgments for themselves and to act on those judgments, not by seeking to suppress speech, but by openly and vigorously contesting the ideas that they oppose. Indeed, fostering the ability of members of the university community to engage in such debate and deliberation is in an effective and responsible manner is an essential part of the university's educational mission, end quote. So this is, of course, going to be a key part of our conversation today. Most importantly, I just want to mention, to conclude my introduction, Professor Stone is a Penn alum. That's how initially we managed to make the connection despite his demanding schedule. And we were very much hoping to welcome him in person back to Philadelphia this fall. Unfortunately, that's impossible, but hopefully he will still be able to make it in person at a later date. For now, I'm excited to hear his thoughts about the First Amendment, the Chicago Statement, and our current understanding of academic freedom. A quick procedural note before Professor Stone starts his presentation. He will speak first. You're welcome to raise questions through the Q&A function as he speaks. We have a few Penn classes in attendance, so if you are a student in Professor Steppenwolf's Legal Studies 221 or Professor Rosenfeld History 133, or if you're a Paideia Fellow, please identify yourself when you're asking a question through the Q&A function. And after the initial presentation, we will open up for discussion, starting with student questions. And then we will move to general audience questions, which you are welcome to start raising at any time. And I'm sure if you could clap, you would all join me in welcoming Professor Stone, please.
Thank you, Professor. It's wonderful to be back at Penn. I've been back a few times since I graduated, but it's always lovely to not be there and be there at the same time. So I'd like to begin by telling you a bit about my world. It is the world of the law. More specifically, it is the world of constitutional law. Now, law is about stories. It is about real people involved in real disputes with real consequences. So I shall begin with a story. This story begins during World War I. As you may or may not know, World War I was not a particularly popular war with the American people, whose sympathies were divided. Many Americans vigorously opposed the Wilson administration's decision to intervene in the brutal conflict that was then raging in Europe, arguing that our intervention was both unwise and immoral. Not surprisingly, such opposition did not sit well with the government. In 1917, Attorney General Thomas Gregory attacking the loyalty of war opponents, declared, quote, "May God have mercy on them, for they can expect none from an avenging government." Gregory wasn't kidding about the avenging government. In 1918, Congress enacted the Sedition Act, which made it a crime for any person to utter any disloyal, scurrilous, or abusive language intended to cause contempt for the government of the United States, the Constitution, or the flag. True to the Attorney General's threat, during the war, federal authorities launched more than 2,000 prosecutions against individuals who wrote or spoke against the war or the draft. One such prosecution involved 5 young Russian Jewish immigrants. In the summer of 1918, the United States sent a contingent of Marines to Vladivostok in Russia. Fearing that this was the first step of an American effort to crush the Russian Revolution, these 5 self-proclaimed socialists threw several thousand copies of each of 2 leaflets, one in English, the other in Yiddish, from several rooftops on the Lower East Side of New York City. The leaflets, which were boldly signed "The Rebels," were addressed to other Russian immigrants. After stating that the rebels hated German militarism, they warned those who worked in ammunition factories that they were also producing bullets, bayonets, and cannons to murder not only the Germans, but also your dearest, your best, who are in Russia and who were fighting for their freedom. The rebels were immediately arrested by the military police. After a controversial trial, they were convicted of violating the Sedition Act of 1918. The trial judge, disgusted by their behavior and their beliefs, sentenced the rebels to terms ranging up to 20 years in prison. The rebels appealed their convictions to the Supreme Court of the United States, claiming that their convictions violated the First Amendment, which guarantees Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech. In Abrams versus United States, the Supreme Court, in a 7-2 decision, rejected this claim and upheld the convictions. For the majority of the court, this was an easy case. Because the natural tendency of the defendant's speech was to generate opposition to the war, it was not within the freedom of speech protected by the Constitution. Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes, joined by Justice Louis Brandeis, dissented. Holmes's dissenting opinion in Abrams is worth reading, for it remains one of the most eloquent statements ever written by a justice of the United States Supreme Court about the freedom of expression. Holmes wrote, quote, "Persecution for the expression of opinion seems to me perfectly logical. If you have no doubt of your premises and want a certain result with all your heart, you naturally want to sweep away all opposition. But," he added, "when men have realized that time has upset many fighting faiths, they may come to believe that the ultimate good desired is better reached by free trade in ideas, that the best test of truth is the power of the thought to get itself accepted in the competition of the market, and that truth is the only ground upon which our wishes can safely be carried out." Holmes therefore concluded, quote, "We should be eternally vigilant against attempts to check the expression, even of opinions that we loathe and believe to be fraught with death, unless they so imminently threaten compelling government interests that an immediate check is necessary to save the nation." Now, I first read this passage, written just over a century ago, when I was a law student at the University of Chicago, exactly half a century ago. It has engaged my energy and curiosity ever since. Indeed, I think it's fair to say that it was my puzzling over this specific passage that, for better or worse, put me on the path to my career, and indeed to my giving this talk to you today. But now I must change direction a bit, for this is not to be a discourse on the First Amendment itself. It is rather to be a talk about academic freedom. Happily, these are not unrelated subjects. To the contrary, the longer I have puzzled over the meaning of free expression, and the longer I've thought about education, the more the two seem to me to converge. Indeed, neither is really worth all that much without the other. And with that in mind, I'd like to turn to what I see as the intersection of free expression in education and to the subject of academic freedom. For it is at that intersection that we will find the most fundamental values of the world of higher education. Now, I hope to accomplish two things in this part of my talk. First, I will trace briefly the history of academic freedom, for it's only by understanding where we have been that we can appreciate, in both senses of that word, where we are today. Second, I will offer some thoughts about what all of this means for us today and about the responsibilities that we today bear in common. Now, it's important to understand that, like freedom of speech, academic freedom is not a law of nature. It does not exist of its own force. It is always vulnerable and should never be taken for granted. Indeed, until well into the 19th century, real freedom of thought was neither practiced nor even professed in American colleges. To the contrary, any real freedom of inquiry or expression in American colleges in this era was smothered by the dominance of religion and by the prevailing theory of doctrinal moralism, which assumed that the worth of any idea must be judged by what the institution's leaders declared its moral value to be. Thus, through the first half of the 19th century, American colleges squelched any notion of free and open discussion or of intellectual curiosity. Any student or faculty member who dared to argue, for example, that women were equal to men, that blacks were equal to white, or that homosexuality was not immoral, would surely be expelled or fired without hesitation. Similarly, through the first half of the 19th century, as the nation moved towards civil war, any professor or student in the North who openly defended slavery, or any professor or student in the South who openly challenged slavery, could readily be dismissed, disciplined, or expelled. When a professor at the University of North Carolina, for example, expressed sympathy for the 1956 Republican presidential candidate, the students burned him in effigy and he was dismissed by the Board of Trustees. And when a professor at Franklin College in Pennsylvania admitted that he was not an abolitionist, he was promptly fired. Several decades later, a furious battle arose over Charles Darwin's theory of evolution, with traditionalists charging not only that Darwin was wrong, but also that his beliefs were dangerous, immoral, and ungodly. As a consequence of this conflict in the academy over evolution versus creationism, new academic goals for the first time came to be embraced. For the first time, to criticize as well as to preserve traditional moral values and understandings became an accepted function of higher education. And by 1892, William Rainey Harper, the first president of the University of Chicago, could boldly assert, quote, "When for any reason the administration of a university attempts to dislodge a professor or punish a student because of his political or religious sentiments, at that moment the institution has ceased to be a university." But despite such noble sentiments, the battle for academic freedom has been a continuing and fiercely contentious one. In the closing years of the 19th century, for example, businessmen who had accumulated vast industrial wealth began to support colleges and universities on an unprecedented scale. But that support was not without strings. And during this era, professors who offended wealthy donors by criticizing their business practices were dismissed from such leading institutions as Cornell and Stanford. Then, during World War I, patriotic zealots persecuted and, as we've seen, even prosecuted those who questioned the wisdom or the morality of the war or the draft. In the face of such outrage, universities collapsed almost completely in their defense of academic freedom. Students and professors were systematically expelled and fired at colleges and universities across the nation, merely for encouraging a spirit of indifference towards the war. Similar issues arose again with a vengeance during the Cold War in the age of Joseph McCarthy. In the late 1940s and 1950s, most colleges and universities excluded those even suspected of communist sympathies from university life. Yale President Charles Seymour, for example, went so far as to boast that, quote, "There will be no witch hunts at Yale because there will be no witches. We will neither admit nor hire anyone with communist sympathies." Now, as this history demonstrates, the freedom to question, the freedom to challenge, the freedom to inquire, are not to be taken for granted. Academic freedom is, in fact, a hard-bought acquisition in an endless struggle to preserve the right of each individual, student and faculty alike, to seek wisdom, knowledge, and truth, free of the censor's sword. But what does this have to do with us? Well, in a radio address to America in 1931, the Irish playwright George Bernard Shaw startled his audience with the following proposition, quote, "Every person who owes his life to civilized society and has enjoyed its costly protections and advantages should appear at reasonable intervals before a properly qualified jury to justify his existence, which should be summarily and painlessly terminated if he fails to do so." Now, I do not advocate such a program, but I do suggest that every one of us who enjoys the protections and advantages of our hard-won system of academic freedom has a responsibility to justify our existence under it. Excuse me. Now, there are several ways in which we can meet this responsibility. First, we must defend academic freedom when it comes under attack. Like every liberty that is precious to us, the preservation of academic freedom demands vigilance, determination, and sometimes courage. Second, we must struggle to define the meaning of academic freedom for our time. As we saw in Abrams, the Constitution's guarantee of freedom of speech is not self-defining. Neither is academic freedom. Each generation must give life to this concept in the face of the distinctive conflicts that arise over time. Today, the principal challenge to academic freedom comes not from outside the academy, but from within it, particularly from students themselves, some of whom demand censorship of ideas that they find distasteful and offensive, and also from faculty members and university administrators who, afraid to disappoint their students, too often surrender academic freedom to charges of offense. And to give just a few examples of recent incidents, several colleges and universities, including Johns Hopkins, Brown, and Williams, withheld speaker invitations because of student objections to the views of the invited speakers. Colorado College suspended a student for making a joke that made fun of feminism. The State University of New York denied promotion to a professor who criticized the university's affirmative action program. William & Mary and the University of Colorado disciplined students for criticizing their affirmative action programs. Students at Vanderbilt University demanded that a tenured professor be fired for writing an op-ed in which he raised questions about Islam. The University of Kansas disciplined a professor for mocking the National Rifle Association. And Louisiana State University fired a professor because some of her students complained that they'd been made to feel uncomfortable by the use of profanity in class. At Wesleyan University, after the school newspaper published a student op-ed criticizing the Black Lives Matter movement, students demanded that the university defund the school paper. At Amherst, students demanded that the administration remove posters stating that all lives matter. At Emory, students demanded that students who had chalked Trump in 2016 on the university's sidewalks should be punished because, in their words, the university is supposed to be a safe place for students, and this made us feel unsafe. And in a number of institutions, including DePaul, Claremont McKenna, the University of California at Irvine, San Francisco State, Middlebury College, and the University of California, Berkeley, students and community members physically obstructed access to venues or shouted down speakers whose views they opposed, causing the events to be canceled. Now, to put all this in perspective, a recent survey revealed that 72% of current college students support disciplinary action against any student, faculty member, or speaker who expresses views deemed by them to be racist, sexist, homophobic, or otherwise offensive. So where did all of this come from? It was not too long ago when students were demanding the right to free speech. Now, at least some students demand the right to be free from speech that they find to be upsetting, offensive, or disturbing. What explains this profound shift in attitude? Well, one often expressed theory is that at least some members of this generation of students have been raised by so-called helicopter parents who protected and celebrated them in every way, shielding them from the risks of failure, frustration, and defeat. On this theory, these students, unlike their predecessors, have never learned how to deal effectively with challenge, uncertainty, insults, or fear. They therefore demand the right to be protected from speech that they find to be offensive, hurtful, or demeaning. If this is so, then the proper role of a university is not to shield those students from distressing and offensive ideas, but to prepare them for the challenges of the real world. The goal of university should not be to insulate students from discomfort and insecurity, but to enable them to become strong and effective citizens of the world, a world that will not shield them from such expression. Now, another possible explanation of this phenomenon is that this generation of students is more attuned than their predecessors were to the injustices of society, to the harmful impact of hateful expression, and to the inequalities that poison our nation. To the extent this is so, it might be in part in response to the creation of social media. When I was in college, we were rarely exposed to hateful expression. The media never carried it, and although we knew it existed, we rarely confronted it. The world of social media has changed all that. Today, it is difficult not to encounter hateful expression. On this view of the matter, students today are not timid, but bold. They seek not shelter, but justice. They understand the ugliness of such expression, and they want to protect both themselves and their classmates from the vitriol that now poisons some forms of expression. Still, another possible explanation of this phenomenon is that some students, particularly those who come from disadvantaged, marginalized, and discriminated against backgrounds, have always felt unwelcome on college campuses. But in the past, they simply remained silent. They felt that if they spoke up about this, they would be demeaned and treated as if they were not to be taken seriously. On this view of the matter, this generation of college students, particularly those who themselves feel unwelcome and alienated, deserve credit, because instead of remaining silent in the face of oppression, they have the courage to demand equality and respect. And my own view, for what it's worth, is that there is an element of truth in all of these perspectives. The question is what to do about all this. Faced with the ongoing challenge to academic freedom in American universities, in 2014, University of Chicago President Robert Zimmer charged a faculty committee with the task of drafting a formal statement for the university on freedom of expression. The goal of that committee, which I chaired, was to stake out our university's position on these issues. The committee consisted of 7 distinguished faculty members from across the university, and after broad consultation, we produced a brief 3-page report. And at the risk of being self-indulgent, I want to share with you some excerpts from that report. Now, I know that some of you have been given the report and have actually read it, so this is redundant, but I assume that others in the audience have not done so. So, quote, because the University of Chicago is committed to free and open inquiry in all matters, it guarantees all members of our community the broadest possible latitude to speak, write, listen, challenge, and learn. Except insofar as limitations on that freedom are necessary to the functioning of the University of Chicago fully respects and supports the freedom of all members of our community to discuss any problem that presents itself. Of course, the ideas of different members of the university will often and quite naturally conflict, but it is not the proper role of the university to attempt to shield individuals from ideas and opinions that they find unwelcome, disagreeable, or even offensive. Though the university greatly values civility, and although all members of the university community share in the responsibility for maintaining a climate of mutual respect, concerns about civility and mutual respect can never be used as a justification for closing off discussion of ideas, however offensive or disagreeable those ideas may be to some members of the community. The freedom to debate and to discuss the merits of competing ideas does not, of course, mean that individuals may say whatever they wish, wherever they wish. The university may restrict expression that violates the law. that falsely defames a specific individual, that constitutes a genuine threat or harassment, that unjustifiably invades a substantial privacy or confidentiality interest, or that is otherwise directly incompatible with the core functioning of the university. But these are narrow exceptions to the general principle of freedom of expression. And it is vitally important that these exceptions never be used in a manner that is inconsistent with the university's deep commitment to a completely free and open discussion of ideas. In a word, the university's fundamental commitment is to the principle that debate or deliberation may not be suppressed because the ideas put forth are thought by some or even by most members of the university community to be offensive, unwise, immoral, or wrong-headed. It is for the individual members of the university community themselves, not for the university as an institution, to make those judgments individually, and to act on those judgments not by seeking to suppress speech, but by openly and vigorously contesting the ideas that they oppose. Indeed, fostering the ability of members of the university community to engage in such debate and such deliberation in an effective and responsible manner is an essential part of the university's educational mission. As a corollary to the university's commitment to protect and promote free expression, members of the university community must also act in conformity with the principle of free expression. Although members of the university community are free to criticize and contest the views expressed on campus, and to criticize and contest speakers who are invited to express views on campus, they may not obstruct or otherwise interfere with the freedom of others to express views that they happen to reject or loathe. To this end, the university has a solemn responsibility not only to promote a lively and fearless freedom of debate and deliberation, but also to protect that freedom when others attempt to restrict it. End quote. Now, interestingly, when we wrote this report, and those of you who saw it, the report could see this, we were thinking only about the University of Chicago. Indeed, the first page and a half of it simply talks specifically about the history of our own university. And so we were writing this as a report of the university for the university, period. To our surprise, the report has had a national and even international impact. Indeed, it's now been adopted by more than 70 other colleges and universities, including such diverse institutions as Princeton, Columbia, the University of Minnesota, the University of Missouri, Purdue, Johns Hopkins, American University, Amherst, and the University of Wisconsin, to name just a few. Okay, now that I've finished congratulating myself, let me elaborate just a bit. Why should a university take the position that faculty and students should be free to advance any and all ideas, however offensive, obnoxious, or wrong-headed they might be? First, one thing we've learned from bitter experience is that even the ideas we hold to be most certain might in fact turn out to be wrong. As confident as we might be in our own wisdom, experience teaches that certainty is different from truth. If those who believed with absolute certainty that the earth was the center of the universe were wrong, if those who believed with absolute certainty in creationism were wrong, if those who believed that slavery was natural, right, and proper were wrong, if those who believed that a woman's place is in the home were wrong, if those who believed that homosexuals were degraded perverts were wrong, then why should we have the arrogance to think that we are unquestionably right about our own beliefs today? The only wise approach, as Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes made clear, is to acknowledge the risk that our certainties might be wrong as well, and that they too must always be open to challenge and to question. Second, experience teaches that the suppression of speech breeds the suppression of speech. If today I am permitted to silence those whose views I find distasteful, I have then opened the door to allow others down the road to silence me. The neutral principle of no suppression of ideas protects us all. And this is especially important in the current situation. For in the long run, it is likely to be minorities, whether religious minorities, racial minorities, political minorities, whatever, who are most likely to be silenced once censorship is deemed to be acceptable. Indeed, without a vibrant commitment to freedom of speech, our nation would never have seen a civil rights movement. It would never have seen a women's rights movement. It would never have seen a gay rights movement, all of which would have been suppressed by intolerant majorities. Censorship is never a one-way street, and this is a door we do not want to open. Indeed, it is important to remember that a robust protection of free speech is especially important to dissenters and to minority groups, because if censorship is permitted and becomes accepted, then it is ultimately they who will suffer the most. Third, a central precept of free expression is the concern with chilling effect. That problem is especially acute today because of the effects of social media. It used to be the case that students and faculty members were willing to take controversial positions, in part because the risks to them of doing so were relatively modest. One could say something provocative or outrageous in order to stir debate, and the statement soon disappeared from view. But in a world of social media, where every comment one makes can be circulated to the world and can be called up later by prospective employers or graduate schools or neighbors or dates with the mere click of a button, the potential cost of speaking openly and courageously and boldly, of taking controversial positions, of taking risks, is greater than ever before in history. Indeed, according to a recent survey, 65% of all college students now say that it is unsafe for them to express unpopular views. And this clearly has an effect on faculty as well. In this setting, it is especially important for institutions of higher learning to stand up and to encourage free expression. So how should this work in practice? Should students, faculty, and other speakers be allowed to express whatever views they want, however offensive they might be to others? Yes, absolutely. Should those who disagree and are offended by the views and speech of others be allowed to condemn those views and those speakers in the most vehement terms? Yes, absolutely. Should students, faculty, and community members who oppose a speaker be permitted to disrupt an event in order to prevent the individual from speaking? Absolutely not. Although non-disruptive protests are both permitted and encouraged, disruption of the rights of others to speak and to listen is wholly incompatible with the central principle of academic freedom. Should those who are offended and who disagree with the views of others be allowed to demand that the institution punish those who have offended them? Yes, absolutely. Should a university punish those whose speech annoys, offends, or insults others? Absolutely not. So what, though, should a university do? First, a university should educate the students and faculty about the importance of civility and mutual respect. As a former student wrote me recently, a university has an obligation to create a community of people as well as a community of ideas, a place where everyone feels certain that they are unambiguously welcome. This must be a core institutional value, but it is a value that must be reinforced and reaffirmed by education and by example, not by censorship. Second, a university should encourage free, open, and robust disagreement, argument, and debate. It should educate its students about the history, the importance, and the fragility of free speech. And it should instill in its students and faculty the importance of winning the day by facts, by ideas, and by persuasion, rather than by force, disruption, or censorship. Indeed, for an institution of higher education to fulfill its most fundamental mission, it must be a safe space for even the most offensive and disloyal arguments. As Barack Obama observed in a commencement address a few years ago, quote, "No matter how much you might disagree with certain speakers, don't try to shut them down. Let them talk, but have the confidence to challenge them. If the other side has a point, learn from them. If they're wrong, rebut them. Beat them on the battlefield of ideas. You might as well start practicing now, because one thing I can guarantee you, you will have to deal with ignorance, hatred, racism, and stupidity at every stage of your life." Third, a university must recognize that a society, being flawed as it is, the costs of free speech will often fall most heavily upon those groups and individuals who feel the most marginalized, unwelcome, and disrespected. All of us feel that way sometimes, but in our often unjust society, the individuals who most often bear the brunt of free speech, or at least of certain types of free speech, tend to be racial and ethnic minorities, religious minorities, women, gays, lesbians, and transsexuals, immigrants, ideological dissidents, and the like. Colleges and universities must be sensitive to this reality. Even if they cannot solve the problem by censorship, they can and should take other steps to address the special challenges faced by groups and individuals who are most often made to feel unwelcome and unvalued by others. Institutions of higher learning must take this challenge seriously. They should encourage civility and mutual respect. They should support students who feel vulnerable, marginalized, silenced, and demeaned. They should help those students learn how to speak up, how to respond effectively, how to challenge those whose attitudes, whose words, whose beliefs, and whose actions offend, appall, and outrage them. This is a core responsibility of our institutions, for the world is not a safe space, and it is our job to enable our graduates to win the battles that they will need to fight in the years and decades to come. This is not a challenge that universities can or should ignore. Now, speaking of the responsibility of universities, I should address one other critical facet of these issues. Suppose those who oppose a speaker, whether they be students, faculty, or community members, disregard their responsibility to respect the freedom of speech and threaten violence or otherwise disrupt an event in order to prevent an invited speaker from speaking. What should the university do in that situation? After the events of Charlottesville, this is an especially important question. The simple solution is for the institution to, quote, play it safe and just refuse to permit the speaker to come to campus. Just avoid the problem. Indeed, this is the approach several institutions have adopted. The University of Florida and Texas A&M, for example, have announced that they would not permit alt-right speaker Richard Spencer to speak on campus for fear of disruption and even possible violence. But if universities adopt this approach and thus empower those who oppose a speaker to prevent the event from taking place by threatening violence or disruption, what will happen? Such a response will inevitably encourage others who want to exclude a speaker to adopt the same strategy, knowing that they too can shut down speech that they oppose merely by threatening violence or disruption. This invites what the Supreme Court has termed the Heckler's veto. Such a course invites other groups to wield the power of censorship over whatever views they wish to suppress, whether those views be anti-war, pro-Black Lives Matter, anti-immigration, pro-Israel, anti-Trump, pro-abortion, anti-affirmative action, pro-gay rights, whatever. In effect, the Heckler's veto turns the right to free speech over to those who oppose the ideas one wants to express. It's noteworthy, by the way, that the Supreme Court first learned this lesson during the Civil Rights era, when white Southerners threatened violence in order to shut down civil rights marches. What the court concluded is that the responsibility of the city, the police, or the university in such circumstances is to take all reasonable measures to protect the speaker and to enable the event to take place, and that it can constitutionally terminate the event only if it is impossible for it to prevent a clear and present danger of serious harm. Short of that, the Heckler's veto, the court said, cannot prevail. Now, I should make one other important point about the strategy of disruption. It is counterproductive. What it does is to give the speaker and her ideas greater visibility, turns her into a martyr, and enables her to sell books, get on cable news, and promote her views more effectively than otherwise. People like Richard Spencer, Ann Coulter, and Milo Yiannopoulos, for example, were complete unknowns until they were made famous by violent protests against their views. Now they are household names. As the Southern Poverty Law Center recently explained in a policy statement about alt-right on campus, quote, when the alt-right personality is scheduled to speak on campus, the most effective course of action is to deny the speaker the one thing she wants most, a spectacle. Alt-right personalities know that their cause is helped by news footage of large, jeering crowds, heated confrontations, and outright violence at their events. It allows them to play the victim and gives them a much larger platform for their racist message. Denying a racist or pro-Trump or anti-abortion speaker such a spectacle is the worst insult that they can endure. What the Southern Poverty Law Center wisely recommends instead is that the best strategy is for those who oppose the speaker not to hold a controversial confrontation, but to hold an alternative event away from the alt-right event to highlight the campus's commitment to inclusion and to the nation's democratic values. This response, they say, is the right one across the board, whether the speaker is a member of the alt-right, an opponent of gay rights, a supporter of abortion rights, or any other speaker whose views you might oppose. It's noteworthy, by the way, that the frequency of incidents involving the suppression of controversial speakers has dropped dramatically in recent years. Now, most recently, that's of course due to COVID, but this phenomenon occurred well before COVID. Although this is mere speculation on my part, I would guess that three factors have most contributed to this development. First, the students who initially invited these provocateurs to campus have no doubt suffered terribly in their reputations, in no small part because of social media. To the extent this is true, I suspect that their successors at the university have backed away from putting themselves in a similar situation. This is both good and bad. It's good insofar as it has reduced significantly the number of invitations to such speakers. It's bad because it is a classic example of chilling effect, of people not exercising their rights because they are afraid of negative consequences. To the extent that current students actually want to invite speakers like Ann Coulter or Milo Yiannopoulos or Richard Spencer to campus, it is unfortunate that they do not do so because they are afraid of the consequences to themselves. Second reason I think this has happened is that it's possible that these speakers themselves have understandably grown tired of dealing with these controversies and have simply decided that enough is enough. That is, it's not worth it to keep going back and being in the midst of these disasters. They're already famous. They already can get on TV whenever they want. They can already get their articles published in major newspapers and magazines. They don't need to keep going through this because it's obviously not really comfortable. So they probably are no longer as eager to accept invitations if they do come. And third, what I think is the best and most hopeful possible explanation is that students who oppose these speakers have learned the lesson taught by President Obama, the Southern Poverty Law Center, and others. That is, by not disrupting the events, they deny the speakers the attention that they crave, and thus render the whole enterprise pointless. Okay, let me now return to my central theme. What is it that makes for a great educational institution? It is, I submit, the intense, strenuous, and constant intellectual activity of the place. Presented with many points of view, students must be compelled to learn to think for themselves. At a great educational institution, the air should be electric with ideas and questions. And it is from that environment that students derive an intellectual stimulation that will last them the rest of their lives. This is the true meaning of an education. Your responsibility as students is to test what you are taught in every turn, to challenge your teachers, your classmates, and yourselves, to choose your own values and your own beliefs. And to meet this responsibility, you have to be independent, you have to be daring, and you have to be willing to take risks. If students find themselves hesitating, if they feel timid, if they wonder if it's worth it, they should remember the rebels in Abrams. At an age not much older than you, they dared to take on the government of the United States. Students can certainly take on a fellow student or a mere professor. It's only by taking risks, by daring to ask hard questions, that real contributions are achieved. At a serious academic institution, we should never forget that the only appropriate response to even the most withering question is not resentment, but gratitude. Fulfilling the responsibility of academic freedom means more than challenging one's classmates or one's teachers. It also means challenging yourself. It means being willing to reconsider what you yourself have come to accept as true. In 1921, after 2 years in prison, Molly Steimer, one of the Abrams rebels, was deported by the United States to the Soviet Union. It was not what she expected. Disappointed in the political, social, and economic system that she found in the Soviet Union, Steimer again began agitating and protesting against this government, the Soviet Union. Again, she was arrested, prosecuted, and convicted of sedition. In 1923, she was deported from the Soviet Union. Now, I don't know for sure, but I rather suspect that this was an unparalleled achievement. To be convicted of sedition and deported within 5 years from both the United States and the Soviet Union. Whatever else one might think of her, Molly Steimer was not afraid to reconsider her positions. Molly Steimer, by the way, I should say, is one of my personal heroes, and you should Google her and find out more about her. In 1919, a majority of the Supreme Court of the United States in the Abrams case rejected the bold approach of Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes and opted for a safe view of the First Amendment. 50 years later, the Supreme Court unanimously overruled the majority opinion in Abrams, and embracing Justice Holmes's dissenting opinion in that case, held that the government may not punish even speech that we loathe and believe to be fraught with death, unless that speech is both intended and likely to incite imminent lawless action. To reach this result, the justices had to challenge the first principles of their predecessors and to overturn half a century of accepted wisdom. A great university, like a successful court, must dedicate itself to the rigorous, open-minded, and unyielding search for truth. Students will learn in such institutions to ask the hard questions. But it's not enough to examine the premises, the beliefs, and the assumptions of an earlier time and find them wanting. It is too easy to dismiss those who thought that the earth was the center of the universe, that its resources were boundless, that only men should vote, that marriage is only for people of the opposite sex, or that separate could ever be equal. We must remember that we too hold beliefs that our children and our children's children will rightly come to regard as naive, foolish, and perhaps even obscene. We must be prepared to challenge our own beliefs, to reform our world, just as the rebels in Abrams struggled to reform theirs. We too must challenge the nature of things. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Stone. That was such a wonderful introduction to a pressingly important issue. And I have to say that as much as I've had concerns over the last couple years about the broad endorsement of the Chicago Statement by various institutions, I find myself agreeing with a lot of what you're saying. I still have a lot of questions myself, especially in light of your very final sentence here, where we too must be open to reconsidering our views, which actually brings back to mind the concluding comment from Howard Gilman, who spoke with us yesterday, and he said we need to be open to reconsider our views about open expression as well, right? So one of the things that, or one of the values that we have to be open to considering is the way that we frame and understand free speech and its applications. But maybe we can, well, I welcome a comment from you on this, but if you would like, we can really start with student questions as we suggested. And we can start with Sophie Rosenfeld, who will raise some questions from her class. And I invite the audience, of course, to continue putting questions in the Q&A function. Please, Sophie.
Hi, thanks so much. And I'm going to read a question from Thomas Wang, who's a student in History 133. And it goes like this. Besides tangible measures that universities may take to limit freedom of speech, such as defunding newspapers or removing signs, I'm wondering what Professor Stone thinks about the inherent unbalance between liberal and conservative voices in the academic environment. Rather than erasing voices deemed to be offensive, conservative voices are often informally suppressed or just ignored on campus. How should universities address this, quote, organic and natural favor, unquote, for liberalism, which does have its merits in many ways, on campus?
Well, I think that it is important that students, faculty, and others hear different sides of issues. And I think that universities should be very supportive of those individuals and groups that have distinctive points of view that aren't being heard. And that doesn't matter to me who they are or what their positions are, but I think the university should, in fact, encourage a wide range of positions and of views. And that might mean, in some circumstances, providing special resources for groups and organizations that have views that should be heard, but don't have much support for them. So I think having events where it's perfectly common, for example, certainly in law schools, for instance, it's perfectly common, even if it's true, I don't know this, but even if it's true, that a substantial majority of law professors and law students are liberal, that in events that take place in the law schools, there is typically an even balance between the speakers who are actually being presented on various issues. So if you have a panel talking about abortion or gay rights, or about President Trump, or about Ruth Bader Ginsburg, it's almost always the case that you have panels of people that are more or less representative of the range of positions. Whether that correlates with the faculty or student proportions is not really of any interest to anyone. They want the views to be expressed. And I think that's legitimate. I think that's important, and it should be done.
I have a question coming from Brian Susek, who I think is at UC Davis. And he's asking, can you expand on the Chicago statement's claim that it is not for a university or as an institution to make judgments about what is unwise or immoral? I understand he says that the institution should not cut off debate over its values or require all its members to agree with its values that it endorses and promotes. But do you really believe that the University of Chicago doesn't and shouldn't endorse or promote any particular values or truths?
The University of Chicago has something that is known as the Calvin Report. Harry Calvin, who was my professor at the First Amendment and was one of the great constitutional and First Amendment scholars of his time, was the chair of a committee appointed in 1967 to deal with the issue, which was triggered particularly by the Vietnam War at that moment, about whether universities, or in particular the University of Chicago, should as an institution take positions on political matters. And the Calvin Report, which is worth reading, it's available on the university website, basically and clearly determined that the university should not take positions on any public issues or matters, except when they directly relate to the functioning of the university itself. So for example, if the government wants to prohibit affirmative action in universities, then universities can take a position on that. But in terms of general issues in society, the university is not to take positions precisely in order to encourage open debate and discourse within the institution. Because if the university takes a position on, say, abortion, or on whether a particular Supreme Court nominee should be confirmed, then the danger is that will have the effect of stifling those who disagree. They will be reluctant to take positions that disagree with what the university has said is the right position, both faculty and students. And so the Calvin Report takes the view that universities should not take positions on issues of public policy, except in those rare instances when the issues are directly involved with the university itself as an institution. And Chicago has done a pretty good job of following that. And these days it's become challenging because of some of the issues about Black Lives Matter and so on, where there are demands that the university should take positions on such questions. But it is done pretty well in holding up to that. But it is basically, again, about promoting an environment in which faculty and students feel free to take their own positions, even if they disagree with the position the university would have taken if it took one.
Great. So I think we have our next question coming from Amy Seppinwall, related to the topics raised in your class. Amy, I don't know if you're ready to, yeah.
Yes, thank you. So in fact, my question, I think, picks up on some of the remarks you were just making in response to Brian's question. One of the themes that's emerged in my classes we've talked about campus speech has to do with questions around complicity on the part of the institution where it declines to intervene. And you've been really thoughtful about productive ways that the institution can intervene or set up certain circumstances that allow for robust conversation, even while trying to sustain equal regard or respect for all of its members. To make this a little more pointed, imagine that you have a set of students who sends very derogatory, racist emails to African-American students on the campus. In your remarks, you suggested that a proper form of response is to have the university help support these African-American students in offering their own responses. But I'm wondering if you would think it permissible for the university to come out and condemn the emails, right? I mean, you have worries about the sort of coercive force of the university voice on the one hand, but on the other hand, as you know, this obligation to ensure that everyone feels empowered to speak and everyone's voice is going to be attributed to the same amount of credibility or authority. So may the university condemn these emails? Must the university condemn these emails? What do you think?
Sorry, and that just really follows up on the question that we have in the Q&A from Amanda Thompson about the other steps that universities may take. So regarding this example that Amy raises, please.
So first thing I'd say is that, as I noted in his report states, the university has a responsibility to promote civility and mutual respect. And to the extent someone engages in expression that is truly harassing or threatening to another person, the university can take action in that circumstance. So if someone is and this goes in both directions, because one thing I've heard is students on the right these days claiming that they get these emails from people on the left. So it is, today it's two-sided. Again, I don't know what the proportions are, but, and I do know that racial comments are in many ways much more offensive than ideological or political comments, but the kind of ugly and inappropriate and threatening, harassing comments is a two-way street, in fact. But I would say one thing the university should do is educate its students that this is inappropriate. This is not the way we should be dealing with one another. And to harass and to threaten people is not A, within the bounds of free speech, and B, it is not a way of behaving that we think promotes the kind of environment and discourse and disagreement that the university aspires to. Whether the university can condemn this, it's complicated because it depends on, does it really constitute something that can fairly be defined as a threat or as harassment? And those are very vague concepts in situations like this. But to the extent it does constitute that, and one is willing to state that objectively, I think it's fine to say this is not an appropriate thing to do, and even you can be punished for it if it's extreme enough. So I do think the university, most importantly, has to educate people. I mean, partly our students need to understand that this is not the way you behave. This is disgraceful, it's embarrassing. Even if you have a right to do it, it's awful and it's ugly. And it's not admirable, and people will not respect you and should not respect you for it. And I think universities should educate the community in those ends. That doesn't mean that's going to work perfectly, but I think that's the first step that has to be taken. And I think universities should take it fairly aggressively. I want to come back to the question that Professor Ben Baroth raised at the beginning about rethinking free speech, just because I think it's an interesting and important question. I would say absolutely. I mean, I think that the principle of free speech, like every other principle or belief, is always legitimately subject to questioning. That I hold a particular belief at this moment, and that I believe this is the best way of thinking about the problem, doesn't mean it is. And I would be the first person to concede that proposition. And let's argue. Let's have an argument about it. I'm perfectly open to that. And in fact, over time, we have evolved in our thinking about free speech in all sorts of ways. And I think that's a completely healthy and appropriate thing to do. And indeed, part of the point about something like the Chicago principles is to say that this is what we now believe is the right approach for the university. But it's perfectly possible that a year from now or 10 years from now, either as the world changes or as people think about things differently, they'll conclude that was stupid. In the same way that universities had all sorts of policies they believed were right in the past about not admitting African Americans, for example. And that was open to question, and they realized, oh my God, what were we thinking? And they've changed it. Maybe that's true with this too. I don't know.
Right, that's great. And I wonder what you do too with people who see even questions like this as still being open, right? So are you ever, as a university, allowed to say, we feel that this is a closed question? It's not actually of interest to debate whether, for example, the climate is changing, or whether women should have the vote, or whether, as you just said, we should admit people of different races to the university. Is it ever the point where you say, well, as an individual, you may express your views on this, but as an institution, beyond supporting your freedom to say that, we really think this is not a very good topic of discussion in our classrooms or in our sponsored events?
At least because of the Calvin Report, the University of Chicago would not take such a position. As I said, it understands that there are things we believe are absolutely true today. But we also know that some of them are wrong, and we don't trust ourselves to make the decisions as to which of them are absolutely true and which of them are only 99% true and which of them only 95% true. Let's talk about it. Let's debate it.
Great. Our next questions are coming through from the Q&A queue from Matt Schaefer, who is our postdoctoral fellow for this year at the Mitchell Center. Please, Matt.
Thanks. Yeah, there are two questions that I want to sort of pull together and ask at once that are in the queue, because I think they approach a particular kind of question here from different angles. The first comes from Liz Jones, and it echoes a little bit something that was said earlier, but I think from a slightly different angle. She asks, I'm wondering about directionality of suppression and the relative degree or strength of suppression from faculty versus students. A lot of what you discussed relates to student populations suppressing speech of those with whom they disagree. But I also read a lot about, and my experience would agree with, predominantly liberal faculty suppressing debate or ideas from more conservative students or views. So how do you see these as related or separate? And then so that's one question here. But then the other question that I want to connect this to is Maurizio Alvarado asks, where and how do you draw the line between teaching with absolute academic freedom and conveying political views in the classroom? Now, both of these have something to do with like the sort of political content of faculty statements, but I think there's also a deeper issue that's involved in these questions, which is the way in which different people who operate in different relations to the university as a whole might have to think about their obligations towards academic freedom in different ways, right? So do you think that like the norm of academic freedom should be understood differently by faculty, maybe in the classroom, faculty when they're outside the classroom, by students, and then also, of course, by all the other people who make up a university community, right? Staff, administrators, visitors to campus. How does that sort of play out across these different roles and these different ways that people relate themselves to the institution as a whole?
Okay, so the first question goes back to the sort of liberal conservative issue. It is true that surveys show that a majority of faculty and students in most institutions and nationally identify themselves as more liberal than more conservative. And that's true. Now, one answer to that I know people who are happy to say, is because people in universities are smarter than other people, and being smart correlates with being liberal. And that may be true, right? I mean, that may perfectly well be true. There's no reason to assume that particular ideological positions are equally thoughtful and intuitive and knowledgeable, 50-50 across society. In fact, so one answer is that, well, that's hard to deal with, because the fact is the liberal positions are generally the better, more thoughtful, more informed, more scientific positions. I'm not asserting that, but I'm saying that's one possibility. And then the question is, well, you know, why do you want to create balance when what you're interested in here is not politics? You're interested in knowledge and ideas and intellect. And if that doesn't correlate with political views, why should the university correlate with it? That's one hard response, because you don't want to actually go there, right? But it's actually maybe true. The second possibility is, again, as I said, I think it is important to make sure that different perspectives are heard. And the way institutions tend to do with that is by inviting speakers, or by supporting events that are more balanced than maybe the faculty or the student body is. And I think that's a legitimate and an appropriate thing to do. I'm sorry, the second question, remind me now?
Oh, I'm sorry. The second part of the question had to do with how faculty should draw the line between.
Oh, right. Okay, I remember. Right. So, right. So the core principle of academic freedom is about faculty members engaged in their academic responsibilities. That's the core of it. Research, scholarship, most dramatically. But also in their free expression as citizens. For students, it is in their freedom, both within the discourse of the university, to engage in events and have speakers come and so on. And also obviously in their own discussions and conversations, both within and outside the university. But there are certain places where the definition of academic freedom gets more complicated. First of all, professors in the classroom have certain responsibilities that are directly part of their job. And for me to say, I'm teaching the First Amendment course this quarter, but my academic freedom is I'm going to teach torts instead, or evidence, because I think I feel like that. That's my academic freedom. No, that's not. I have a job, and the job is a constraint on that. Similarly, the student has certain responsibilities, and the professor, to behave with a certain degree of respect and civility in the classroom. That is greater than outside in general discourse. And so there are circumstances where a student or faculty member who engages in truly needlessly offensive speech, which he has a perfect right to do out in public, but to do it in the classroom would be seen as inappropriate. It's a little bit like that professor I mentioned at LSU, where the students in the class protested the fact that she used profanity in class. And the question was it okay for her to do that? If it was a professor who was simply saying, totally unrelated to anything, using the words, and it was just random that she was using that would be problematic. But if she was using it in a way that was relevant to the things she was teaching, because it was part of the literature or whatever, then tough luck, students. You can't prevent that. That's perfectly appropriate. And for employees, again, it's a little bit like the teacher in the classroom. I mean, employees have certain responsibilities. So the editor of the alumni magazine, for example, who chooses to publish an article in the alumni magazine that degrades the university, could probably be fired, because his job is not to do that. He does not have academic freedom to publish whatever he wants. His job is to make the university look good to alumni and to others. So there are limits on the academic freedom. It's not absolute for all people in the community in all circumstances. But when they are engaged in what is regarded as academic activity, then the academic freedom is imperative.
Great, thank you so much for that. And I have, so we're just 10 minutes before the end of our time together, and the Q&A is quite lively. So let me raise two questions from the Q&A that relate both to the way in which speech and the protection of speech applies to governments and to citizens. So one of our committee members, Joe Lowry, is raising the question regarding the boundaries of the Calvin report, right? In the context where, as now, there are a lot of legislation, state and federal, as well as executive actions related to higher education. How shielded are institutions from, you know, engaging more significantly with ideas that are raised in government regulation, which of course you mentioned, such as the BDS regulations, statutes, protecting statues and things like that. So that's one issue. And the other issue that is being raised by my colleague Samuel Freeman at the philosophy department, he's saying you apply rules developed in Abrams and Brandenburg with respect to subversive advocacy against government to racist and religious hate speech directed against other citizens who are vulnerable and cannot defend themselves, right? So he's saying the government can defend itself and other citizens from acts of subversion. So that's a good reason to allow the speech to occur. But racial and religious minorities are more vulnerable and don't necessarily have the capacity to protect themselves. Should we use the same standards of speech protection for expression that is against the government and expression that is against vulnerable minorities?
So on the first question, the Calvin report would say that the university should not take political positions on laws that are proposed unless those laws are directly related to the functioning of the university, not beyond that. One of the issues that's now happening, which is concerning, is that in some states, and maybe even in the federal government, laws are being enacted in the name of free speech to impose upon public and even private institutions certain principles of free speech. And to say, for example, a university, whether private or public, has to adopt the equivalent of the Chicago principles. And there's a couple of problems with this. One of them is that this is a movement that's been completely supported and motivated by political conservatives. And I've had a number of conversations with organizations that are politically conservative that say, hey, we're now doing everything you want us to do. Why don't you support us? Shouldn't you support us? And part of what troubles me about that is my honest view is that this is total cynicism, that they do not generally support free speech. On almost every major controversy we've had in this country, political conservatives have been on the suppression side of the issue. All of a sudden, they've discovered free speech because it's a way of protecting their allies, and suddenly they want to limit what universities can do. And so I keep saying to them, okay, if you want my support, publicly state that you would absolutely support the leader of Planned Parenthood coming to Notre Dame University and giving a speech about the right of abortion. And you think that's essential for the Notre Dame University to allow. And when you're prepared to say that publicly, we can talk again. None of them has ever come back to me. But the deeper question about this is these laws are basically requiring institutions to do what I think the institution should do in terms of adopting commitments to free speech. But I think universities have academic freedom, and they have the right to decide for themselves whether to do this or not. So I would argue to a university that they should adopt the Chicago principles, but I would never have the government compel them to do it. I think that violates the First Amendment. I'm sorry, and the second question was?
The second question from Sam Freeman was regarding using the same principles from Abrams and Brandenburg to protect governments or vulnerable citizens.
I certainly understand the argument. There are two elements to it, I suspect. One of them is the argument that, as was suggested, the government has greater authority to protect itself against the speech that's being advocated by the people who are being arrested or prosecuted in those cases than the targets of racist or other offensive speech are able to protect themselves against them. And in general, I would say that's true. But one has to be careful with it, because first of all, the fact is that the harm, potential harm, caused by speech in wartime is not trivial. That's why the Supreme Court upheld all these convictions during World War I. And they were aware of the fact that any single speaker might not have that much impact. But a lot of different speakers handing out leaflets and making speeches and so on and so forth can persuade increasing numbers of people to refuse to serve in the military, to desert from the military, whatever. And so there's a cumulative effect, which can be significant. What the court was saying is, we don't, in Brandenburg, what the court was saying, we don't even care if it's significant. It has to be clear and present danger of grave harm. And because we don't trust the government to get involved in these things. And I think that similar concern about government decision-making arises in the situation that's being posited. I mean, I'm certainly sympathetic personally to the individuals who are the targets of racist or sexist or homophobic speech. And I do understand that it is deeply hurtful to them in many ways. But if one opens the door to say, well, we only apply a strict standard of justification in very limited circumstances, then that basically says it's all open. Because this is one situation, but there are endless situations where people want to stop speech because it may cause bad things. And in lots of those situations, they will say, well, this is a pretty bad thing. And it doesn't have to be like Brandenburg. You know, if there's a reasonable possibility of a bad thing happening, we can stop it. And the problem is that means that the courts have to start picking and choosing among an endless array of situations where where individuals can coherently claim, this is really harming me, right? But that's true for pro-abortion speech. There are lots of people who say, abortion is immoral, it's horrible, it's the death of children. It's no different than killing 2-year-olds. You can't have people advocate that. That not only does that cause horrible things, that causes me deep emotional distress. So you can't argue in favor. So I mean, the point is you're opening a door that is completely impossible to limit. And that's one of the reasons the court went from the original approach, which said all you need is a reasonable justification to restrict speech, to basically saying, effectively, you cannot restrict speech because the viewpoint is the cause of the concern. For all practice, the Supreme Court has not upheld a restriction on viewpoint, which covers both situations, in 50 years. It has basically said the standard is so high that it's impossible to meet. And the reason for that is because they don't trust the government or themselves to have the power to decide which viewpoints should be given less protection and which should be given more.
Great, thank you for that. And we'll have one brief last question from Jeff Green. And I just want to, so we'll do one brief question and then we'll do a quick summary and remind people of our additional panel this afternoon. Go ahead, Jeff.
Thanks, Sigal, and thank you, Professor Stone, for your lucid remarks. You're clearly arguing for—
You're only lucid, not compelling?
Generally compelling. I'm generally in agreement with you. You are clearly, diagnosing a cleavage in views on free speech on campus, and you're clearly siding with having fewer restrictions. And I do find your arguments mostly compelling, but I'm curious about the language you use to describe your view. and whether you misdescribe it as pure when it's actually a kind of balancing. Just on the rhetorical level, you speak of, the University of Chicago guaranteeing itself, quote, the broadest possible latitude to speak, write, listen, challenge, and so forth. And then you also write of the university's commitment to a completely free and open discussion of ideas. And, I'm asking not if the substance of what you're arguing for is right or wrong, but whether you're over describing it as pure when it shouldn't be, because as you yourself know and argue for, there are places where you would favor restricting speech, not just when it violates the law, but as you point out in your writing, when it would be incompatible with the functioning of the university. So you could imagine someone who would have even less restrictions and say, we don't care about the functioning of the university. We want more speech to go on. And likewise, if there's a genuine threat of harassment, and harassment, of course, is a difficult matter. There's the legal harassment, but there's the extra legal discussion of harassment that would go on in a faculty meeting. And you could imagine someone who had a even more tolerant view of what counts as non-harassing speech than you. And so I'm just wondering if in fact you're on a continuum with your rivals and are not so necessarily principally against them, and that you just balance things a little bit differently than they do, and not that you have entirely different principles about freedom of expression.
So I don't believe, and the report does not mean to state that there's absolute protection of free speech, that anyone can say anything at any time in any manner. It doesn't mean to say that at all. It is, first of all, keep in mind that it's a very short document. It's not a statute, right? It doesn't try to imagine all of the hundreds of possible situations, thousands of possible situations, and to figure out how to resolve each of them. And it recognizes that there are limits, that there are situations. What it's basically suggesting is that the university is committed to the principle that it should go as far as it possibly can, consistent with the functioning of the university, to protect free speech. And it's absolutely true that there are ambiguities all over the document. What does harassment mean? What is a threat? I mean, as a First Amendment lawyer, I know full well those are complicated concepts, and they are open to debate and discussion, and the report doesn't mean to deny that. If it was a 100-page statute, maybe we would try to do all that, but that's not what it was. It was meant to state a set of principles.
Great, thank you so much for that. And that really brings us to the end of our time together, which really flew by so fast for me. I want to really thank Professor Stone for these lucid, compelling, and very engaging comments and exchange with our Penn colleagues and students and with all of us. I want to apologize to the people whose questions remained in the queue. There were too many to take up in this conversation. And I want to invite everyone to join us again at 3:30 for a conversation between Nadine Strawson and John Powell on the boundaries of speech on campus and beyond. Again, Professor Stone, thank you so much for helping us think together about the Chicago Statement, about academic freedom, and about the state of free speech today. Thank you.
Thank you so much for inviting me. It was really great fun. Wonderful event.
Thank you.